72,000 tons. That is what the Japanese carrier Shinano weighed when she slipped out of Yokosuka harbor on the night of November 28, 1944. The largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen, built on the bones of a battleship meant to rival anything America could put to sea. Her hull was reinforced beyond anything the Imperial Navy had ever floated. On paper, she was supposed to be nearly impossible to sink. She lasted 10 days. Hunting her in the darkness was a single American submarine, USS Archerfish, and a commander named Joseph Enright, a man still haunted by the carrier he let slip away 18 months earlier. In the next 7 hours, he would fire 6 torpedoes at the biggest target any submarine captain had ever lined up in his sights. 4 of them found their mark. By sunrise, the pride of the Japanese Navy, a warship built to be unstoppable, was gone. 1,400 men went down with her, and Japan tried to erase the loss from history itself. This is the story of how one submarine, one gamble, and 4 torpedoes ended the story of the greatest carrier ever built, before she ever fired a shot in anger. The keel was laid in secrecy. May 1940, at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japanese engineers began work on hull number 110, the 3rd ship of the Yamato class, sister to the 2 largest battleships ever built. She was meant to carry 18-inch guns, armor thick enough to shrug off any shell fired at her, a floating fortress, designed to guarantee Japan's dominance of the Pacific for a generation. Workers labored under tarpaulins and canvas screens even in daylight, hiding her shape from prying eyes, from spies, from anyone who might report her true size back to Washington. They gave her a name before she ever touched water, Shinano, after the province where the emperor's ancestors were said to have ruled. Then everything changed in a single morning. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor did not just cripple the American Pacific Fleet. It rewrote the rules of naval warfare, and the men who wrote those rules first were the same officers now building Shinano. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had just proven they could reach across hundreds of miles of open ocean and destroy an enemy fleet before it ever came within sight of its guns. 6 months later, at Midway, Japan learned that lesson twice. In a single afternoon, American dive bombers sent 4 of Japan's finest carriers to the bottom of the sea, and with them went the trained pilots and crews that Japan could not replace in years, let alone months. In June 1942, Japanese Naval Command made a decision that would define Shinano's fate. Hull 110 would not become a battleship. She would become something else entirely. Not just another aircraft carrier. Because she had begun life as a battleship, she carried a battleship's bones. A hull built to absorb punishment. A belt of armor along her waterline drawn from the same design that made Yamato nearly unsinkable. A flight deck reinforced well beyond anything any other carrier in the world could claim. Where a normal carrier was a thin-skinned vessel built for speed and little else, Shinano was something closer to a floating citadel, a ship built on the assumption that she would take hits and keep steaming, while lesser ships would have already slipped beneath the waves. Japanese naval architects believed her compartmentalization, the dense maze of watertight sections dividing her hull into hundreds of separate cells, gave her a level of survivability no carrier had ever possessed. She was not meant to dodge every torpedo. She was meant to absorb them and stay afloat regardless. A ship built less on speed and maneuver than on sheer, stubborn endurance. That was the theory. In the fall of 1944, Japan no longer had the luxury of testing it under controlled conditions. By then, the war Japan had started with such confidence was collapsing around her. American submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them, strangling the home islands of oil, steel, and food, one silent torpedo at a time. American bombers were closing in on the island chains that once formed Japan's outer defense. And now, for the first time, the long-range B-29 superfortress could reach mainland Japan itself, including the naval arsenal at Yokosuka, where Shinano still sat unfinished in her dry dock, exposed under open sky. The order came down in November 1944. Get her out. Commission the ship immediately, whether she was ready or not, and move her somewhere safer to finish the work. She was not ready. Watertight doors throughout the hull were still missing or unsealed, some no more than open frames where steel was supposed to be. Damage control systems meant to pump out flooded compartments were incomplete. Wiring still hanging loose in corridors meant to carry emergency power. Hundreds of civilian shipyard workers were still aboard, still bolting equipment into place, still running cable through passageways that were supposed to have been finished months earlier. The crew, more than 2,000 men, had barely trained together as a unit. Many had never set foot on her at all until the week she was commissioned, learning her passageways the same way a stranger learns a new city, by getting lost in it. None of that mattered anymore. On November 19, 1944, Shinano was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy, the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever built, and one of its most dangerously incomplete warships. Officers who walked her decks in those final days described a strange, uneasy feeling, standing aboard the mightiest ship in the fleet, while workmen still hammered rivets into her bones around them. The air below decks carried the sharp bite of fresh paint and welding smoke, mixed with the salt smell drifting in through open hatches, a ship that still smelled more like a construction site than a warship of the Imperial Navy. Sailors who had spent years aboard older, battle-tested ships found the silence of Shinano's untested machinery unsettling in its own way. There was no history in her steel yet, no scars from past engagements, no crew traditions passed down through hard-won victories, just size and armor, and the quiet, unspoken hope that both would be enough. The plan was simple, and on paper, safe. A short coastal run from Yokosuka to the naval base at Kure, roughly 340 miles away, where she could be finished far from the reach of American bombers. Hug the coastline, travel by night, assign 3 of the Navy's most experienced destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, to screen her from submarines. One quiet voyage, and then months of safety to complete what the shipyard never had time to finish. Command of this voyage fell to Captain Toshio Abe, a veteran officer who had spent most of his career commanding destroyers, ships built for speed and aggression, not for shepherding the largest vessel in the fleet. This was his first time at the helm of anything approaching Shinano's size, and he intended to prove himself equal to it, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had survived years of hard combat and trusted his instincts above almost anything else. Now, on the other side of the Pacific War, another officer was carrying a different kind of weight. Commander Joseph F. Enright was 35 years old, a 1933 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, and in the fall of 1944, he commanded the submarine USS Archerfish, a Balao-class fleet boat built for exactly this kind of hunting. He was good at his job. His crew trusted him. His boat ran clean and efficient, every drill sharp, every system maintained, with the kind of care that comes from a man who has learned, the hard way, what happens when preparation falls short. But there was a memory he could not outrun, one that surfaced in the quiet hours of every patrol, in the space between orders, when there was nothing left to do but think. In May 1943, Enright had commanded a different submarine, USS Dace, and on one patrol, he found himself in the kind of position submarine captains dream about for their entire careers. A Japanese aircraft carrier, minimal escort, a clean firing angle, the sort of shot that should have ended in a kill and a chest full of medals. He fired, he missed, not from bad luck or a jammed torpedo, but because he misjudged the target's speed at the moment that mattered most. Every torpedo passed harmlessly through empty water, while the carrier steamed on, untouched, disappearing over the horizon like a door closing. The Navy did not court-martial him for it. But in the quiet, brutal arithmetic of submarine command, one missed opportunity was enough to end an assignment. He was rotated off base and spent months in administrative postings, while other commanders came home with kills and medals, and their names in dispatches, their photographs in Navy newsletters, their crews celebrated on the docks. It is a particular kind of torment for a man who measures himself by results, watching from behind a desk, while others do the job you know. In your bones, you could have done, if only your calculations had been right, that one night in the dark, the Navy gave him a second chance, command of Archerfish. And since March 1944, Enright had thrown himself into that command with something close to desperation, patrolling the waters around Japan, sinking what he could find, building his crew into one of the more capable boats in the Pacific Fleet, studying every silhouette manual, every tactic, every mistake he had made before, determined never to repeat it. But there had been no defining moment yet, no kill big enough to erase the memory of that missed shot in 1943, no proof, to himself more than anyone else, that he belonged in that command chair, that the Navy had been right to trust him with another boat and another crew's lives. He kept the memory close, not as an excuse, but as a kind of discipline, a reminder that in this war, hesitation and miscalculation cost exactly as much as cowardice, and that the ocean rarely offered a man a second shot at the same target twice. On the evening of November 28, 1944, Shinano slipped out of Tokyo Bay and turned southwest along the coast, her 3 destroyer escorts taking position around her, zigzagging at 18 knots through calm, moonlit water. Her wake stretched white and enormous behind her, a scar cut across the black surface of the Pacific by a hull larger than anything that had ever sailed those waters. Captain Abe stood on the bridge of the largest warship afloat, confident in her armor, confident in her escorts, confident that a short night run along friendly coastline carried little real risk. 200 miles away, a diesel submarine surfaced in the darkness to recharge her batteries, her radar sweeping the empty horizon, her crew going through the familiar, practiced rhythm of a routine night on patrol. Neither man knew it yet, but their 2 ships, one built to be unstoppable, one built to hunt, were converging on the same stretch of black Pacific water, and by morning, only one of them would still be afloat. Somewhere behind Enright, back in the fleet's administrative offices, there were still men who remembered the shot he had missed off Dace, men who had quietly written him off as a captain who folded under pressure at the moment that mattered most. He never spoke of them, never mentioned the sting of their doubt to his own crew, but it rode with him on every patrol, a silent passenger in the cramped confines of Archerfish, waiting for the one night that would finally answer the question for good. November 28, 1944, 8:48 in the evening. Southeast of Tokyo Bay, USS Archerfish rode the surface of a calm, clear Pacific night, her diesel engines rumbling low as she recharged the batteries that kept her alive underwater. Surfacing was always a gamble. A submarine on the surface could see farther and move faster, but she could also be seen. Clear skies and calm seas cut both ways, and every man on watch that night understood it. Then, the radar operator's voice broke the quiet routine. Radar contact, bearing 090, range 25,000 yards, 12 nautical miles out, and it was not a single ship. Multiple contacts, moving fast, holding a course southwest along the Japanese coastline. Commander Joseph Enright was on the bridge within seconds, binoculars already rising to his eyes, scanning the dark horizon until the shapes resolved out of the gloom. 3 smaller vessels, unmistakably destroyers, screening something at their center. And that something was wrong, in a way Enright could not immediately explain. Too large for a cruiser, too large for any battleship silhouette he had ever memorized. He had spent 2 years studying the outlines of every major warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy, committing their shapes to memory, the way another man might memorize scripture, and this shape matched nothing in that catalog. Sound General Quarters. All ahead flank. Come to course 090. Klaxons echoed through the boat. Men dropped bunks and half-eaten meals, and ran for battle stations. The practiced chaos of a crew that had drilled this exact sequence 100 times before. Archerfish surged forward, her twin diesels screaming at full power, chasing a target that, according to the radar plot, was running at 18 to 20 knots and zigzagging on top of it, changing course every few minutes, in a textbook pattern meant to defeat exactly this kind of attack. It was every submarine captain's nightmare in miniature. A target worth everything, moving too fast and too erratically to catch in a straight pursuit. On the bridge, the wind off the open Pacific carried the smell of diesel exhaust and salt spray, and the deck beneath their boots, thrummed with the strain of engines, pushed harder than doctrine allowed for any extended stretch. Below, in the control room, the plotting party bent over their charts under red battle lighting, converting bearings and ranges into a picture none of them could see with their own eyes, trusting instruments and mathematics to tell them where the enemy actually was. Enright had 2 hours of daylight in his memory, and a coastline he had studied more times than he could count, and he made a decision that would either hand him the biggest kill of the war or lose the contact entirely. Navigator, plot a course to intercept. Assume they are making for the Key Strait. Calculate where they will be in 3 hours. The Key Strait was the gateway to Japan's inland sea, the passage every capital ship used to reach the naval bases at Kure and beyond. If this contact was heading for safety, that was where it was going. Instead of running down the target directly, a race Archerfish could not win. Enright chose to gamble everything on a guess about her destination, racing ahead to get in front of her and wait. For nearly 4 hours, Archerfish ran flat out on the surface, diesels straining, the hull shuddering with the effort, every man aboard aware that if the guess was wrong, the contact would slip past unseen in the dark, and the entire night would be wasted. Somewhere in that long, grinding pursuit, the radar contact vanished from the scope entirely. No return, no bearing, nothing but empty ocean on the display. For a long stretch of that chase, nobody on the bridge spoke much at all. Enright stood with his hands on the rail, running the same calculations over and over, the same nagging doubt from May of 1943 creeping back in. A wrong guess about a target's course was not so different from a wrong guess about its speed. Both ended the same way, with an empty sea and a target long gone. Down in the crew's quarters, off-duty men lay in their bunks without sleeping, listening to the diesels scream through the deck plates, counting the minutes the same way their captain was, though none of them would have admitted it. A submarine crew develops its own instinct for tension, a sense for when their commanding officer has staked something personal on the outcome of the next few hours, and that night, every man aboard Archerfish could feel it. The destroyers screening the Japanese formation swept the dark water with their own radar and sonar during those same hours, hunting for exactly the kind of threat Archerfish represented, though they had no way yet of knowing one had already slipped ahead of them into position. It was a race run in the dark by men on both sides who could not see each other, each trusting instruments and training to close a gap neither could measure with his own eyes. Then, just after midnight, the radar operator's voice cut through the tension one more time. Contact bearing 270, range 12,000 yards. The gamble had paid off. The Japanese formation was exactly where Enright's calculations said it would be, and Archerfish was now sitting directly in its path, ahead of the target instead of chasing it. It was, by any measure, the kind of position a submarine captain waited an entire career to find himself in. Diving officer, take her to periscope depth. Make ready all tubes. Prepare for attack. Archerfish slid beneath the surface, silent running protocols taking hold. Ventilation fans shut down. Non-essential machinery went quiet. Men moved through the boat on the balls of their feet, speaking in whispers if they spoke at all, because sound carried through water in ways that could kill a submarine faster than any depth charge. Archerfish became, for those minutes, less a machine than a held breath. Enright raised the periscope and got his first real look at what he had spent the entire night chasing. Through the eyepiece, in the pale moonlight, sat a shape that did not belong in any silhouette manual he had ever studied. A flight deck stretching nearly 900 feet, longer than 3 city blocks laid end to end. An island superstructure rising off the starboard side like a small mountain. A bow wave, even in the darkness, wide and heavy enough to betray a hull, carrying far more mass than any carrier had a right to carry. He knew every silhouette the Imperial Navy had ever put to sea: Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, the carriers that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor and fought through Midway. This was none of them. This was something new, something no intelligence report had ever described to him, a secret the Japanese Navy had kept, even from the men whose job it was to hunt her. Behind him, in the narrow confines of the conning tower, the crew waited in near silence for word of what their captain was seeing, reading his expression more than his words, because 30 seconds of silence from a man who never went silent told them everything they needed to know about the size of what he had found. He lowered the periscope for a moment, breathed once, and raised it again, as if the shape might have resolved itself into something more ordinary the second time. It had not. He did not need a name to know what he needed to do next. He needed to get close enough to kill her without being killed himself. That was not a simple problem. The target held 18 knots and kept shifting course every few minutes, and 3 destroyers moved in a screen around her, sonar sweeping, depth charges racked and ready. Get too close too fast, and the escorts would have Archerfish pinned and dying before a single torpedo left its tube. Stay too far back, and the shot would never have a chance of finding its mark. Come to course 240, all ahead 1/3. Make ready tubes 1 through 6. For nearly 40 minutes, Archerfish crept forward at a crawl, matching the target's zigzag as best the crew could predict it, feeding bearing and range and speed into the torpedo data computer. Every time the great ship shifted course and invalidated the last solution. It was patient, grinding work, the kind that never appeared in the newsreels back home. Torpedoes ran at roughly 46 knots. The target was making 18. A shot fired at where the enemy sat now would miss by hundreds of yards by the time it arrived. A submarine captain was not aiming at a ship. He was aiming at a point in empty ocean where a ship would be in 90 seconds. And if the math was wrong, the whole night collapsed into nothing. Every few minutes, a new course change from the target forced the fire control party to tear up their work and begin again. And each time, Enright felt the same flicker of doubt that had haunted him since 1943, the fear that he would misjudge one number, one bearing, one moment of hesitation, and watch this opportunity vanish the way the last one had. He forced the feeling down each time it rose, the way a man learns to force down fear in any dangerous trade, by focusing entirely on the next number, the next calculation, the next small decision in front of him, rather than the weight of everything riding on it. Then the great ship steadied. She came out of her latest turn and held a straight course, and for the first time in nearly an hour, she gave Enright exactly what he needed. Final bearing and shoot. Standby tubes 1 through 6. Range 1,400 yards. Target speed 18 knots. Angle on the bow 70 degrees starboard. The fire control party called out the numbers in flat, practiced voices, each man doing his part in a chain that had been rehearsed 1,000 times and had never once mattered as much as it did in that moment. Enright's hand rested on the firing key, and for one heartbeat, the memory of May 1943 rose up in him again, the carrier he had once let slip through his hands, the months of quiet disgrace that followed. He pushed it down. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes left the forward tubes at 4-second intervals, each one a 3,200-pound weapon, carrying roughly 640 pounds of high explosive, running hot and true toward a target larger than anything an American submarine had ever engaged in the entire war. Then came the waiting, and the waiting was its own kind of agony. 90 seconds at 46 knots, 90 seconds in which the great ship could still turn and dodge every one of them, in which a faulty exploder could send a torpedo harmlessly into the deep, in which the destroyer screen could catch the telltale wakes on the surface and turn this from a hunt into an execution. The crew counted in silence, the way men count seconds when there is nothing left to do but wait for the outcome of a decision already made. 60 seconds, 70, 80. Then the first explosion rolled through the hull of Archerfish, a deep, heavy concussion that every submariner in that boat recognized in his bones before his mind had fully caught up. A second explosion followed, then a third, then a fourth, 4 hits out of 6, slamming into the starboard side of the largest warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy in the space of a few seconds. A ragged, subdued cheer rippled through the boat, the kind of celebration men allow themselves in a steel tube where sound could still betray them to the destroyers hunting somewhere above. Enright allowed himself one long breath, one moment of something close to relief, though the professional part of his mind was already moving past it. 4 hits from torpedoes carrying that much explosive power should be enough to cripple almost any ship afloat. But this was not almost any ship, and neither he nor his crew yet understood exactly what they had just struck. Take her deep, rig for silent running, come to course 180. Archerfish dove and turned away from the scene, running silent to escape the destroyers that would soon be hunting for the boat that had just gutted their charge. It was standard doctrine, the only sane choice after a successful attack, but it meant Enright would spend the rest of that night not knowing whether he had sunk his target or merely wounded it. Somewhere above, the 3 escort destroyers had already begun their search, sonar pinging through the black water, engines cutting hard turns as they hunted for any trace of the submarine that had just struck their charge. For nearly 2 hours, Archerfish crept through the depths at a fraction of her surface speed, every man aboard listening for the telltale ping of active sonar locking onto their hull, for the distant thud of a depth charge pattern being laid across the water above them. None came close enough to matter. The destroyers, built and trained to protect a ship under attack from the air or gunfire, had no clear picture of where their enemy had fired from, and in the confusion of the crippled giant listing behind them, the hunt for Archerfish never gathered the focus it might have on a calmer night. Behind him, in the dark water he was leaving at flank speed, a different kind of night was only beginning. Aboard the carrier, most of the crew not on watch had been asleep when the torpedoes struck at 3:17 in the morning, 9 hours into an uneventful voyage, with land visible off the port side and Cure still hours away. Few men aboard had truly believed an American submarine would find them this close to the Japanese coast. Then 4 explosions tore through the starboard hull in rapid succession, and belief stopped mattering. The first torpedo struck amidships and detonated inside one of the boiler rooms, killing the men stationed there in an instant and opening the compartment to the sea. The second hit 20 feet away, flooding a second boiler room. The third and fourth landed forward and aft of the first pair, tearing a rough line of breaches down the starboard side. In any other carrier built during the war, 4 hits like these would have been an immediate death sentence. This ship had been built, at enormous cost and years of secrecy, specifically to survive exactly this kind of attack. Captain Toshio Abe received the first damage reports within minutes. 4 torpedo hits, multiple compartments flooding, the ship still making headway under her own power. A noticeable list to starboard, but nothing yet that looked uncontrollable. Abe weighed the reports the way a man weighs a problem he believes he already understands, and he decided the damage was serious but manageable, that the compartmentalization built into this hull would do exactly what it had been designed to do. He ordered the ship to hold course and speed, sent the destroyer escorts out to hunt the submarine that had struck them, and trusted his damage control parties to seal the flooding and keep his ship alive long enough to reach Kure. For a short while, it even seemed to work. Pumps ran at full capacity. Damage control teams moved through smoke and rising water, sealing what doors they could reach, shoring up bulkheads under strain. The list held, for a time, somewhere close to 5 degrees, well within what any officer aboard would have called survivable. The men fighting that flooding were, for the most part, the same green crew who had barely learned the ship's corridors in the days before she sailed. They worked by flashlight in compartments never designed to be navigated in darkness, hauling collision mats and timber shoring through passageways ankle-deep in seawater, following procedures they had drilled only a handful of times before departure. Some of them were still teenagers, assigned to Shinano straight out of basic training with no combat experience at all, thrown now into exactly the kind of crisis their instructors had never had enough time to fully prepare them for. What Abe did not know, what none of the men fighting to save the ship that night fully understood yet, was that the compartmentalization they were counting on existed mostly on paper. The ship had been rushed out of the shipyard 10 days earlier, specifically because there had been no time left to finish her. Watertight doors meant to seal each flooding compartment away from its neighbors had never been fully installed. Passages that should have been closed steel were still open frames, temporary gaps left by workmen who had been aboard finishing the job only hours before she sailed. Water that should have stayed contained in 4 compartments was finding its way, quietly and steadily, into a dozen more. Within the first half hour, the list crept from 5 degrees to 10. Not yet an emergency by the standards of a warship this size, but a number moving steadily in the wrong direction, and moving faster than the pumps could answer it. By 4 in the morning, 1 hour after the torpedoes struck, the list had reached 12 degrees. Abe ordered non-essential crew moved to the port side to help counterbalance the lean, and reduced speed to 15 knots to ease the pressure of seawater forcing itself through the breaches. It bought time, but not much of it. By 5 in the morning, the list stood at 15 degrees, and the flooding had found its way into the engine spaces. Power generation began to falter. Pumps that had been holding the line for 2 hours started failing one after another, overwhelmed by water they could no longer keep pace with. Then the flooding reached the forward aviation fuel tanks. Thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline, stored for aircraft the ship had not yet even taken aboard, began leaking into compartments already full of seawater. Gasoline floats. It spread across the surface of the flooding, seeping into corridors and stairwells throughout the forward half of the ship, filling the air with fumes thick enough to choke on. Men working in those spaces began collapsing where they stood, overcome before they understood what was happening to them. Others stumbled out retching, unable to draw a clean breath, the acrid stench of fuel clinging to their skin and uniforms long after they reached open air. Every man who had served on a ship long enough understood exactly what that smell meant. A single spark anywhere near those fumes, and the flooding would no longer be the worst danger aboard. By 6 in the morning, 3 hours after the attack, the list had reached 18 degrees, and Captain Abe faced the decision no commanding officer wants to make about the ship under his charge. The compartmentalization had failed. The flooding could not be stopped by any means left available to his crew. And somewhere beneath his feet, in flooded, gas-filled compartments, water and fuel and fire hazard were spreading faster than any damage control party could contain. Abe had built his entire career on destroyers, ships that lived or died by speed and instinct, and there was a particular cruelty in watching a vessel this size, this heavily armored, this expensive, in years and resources and secrecy, betrayed not by enemy firepower alone, but by the very haste that had put her to sea before she was ever truly finished. Every report reaching the bridge now carried the same undertone: doors that would not seal, pumps that could not keep pace, compartments flooding through gaps that should never have existed on a warship of this size. The ship's greatest advantage, the dense armor and compartmentalization that had cost Japan years to design and build, was failing not because the design was wrong, but because the ship beneath it had never been given the time to become what her designers intended. The ship built to be the most survivable carrier ever launched. The ship Japan had spent 4 years and untold resources constructing in absolute secrecy, was dying from 4 torpedoes on her very first voyage. At 7:30 in the morning, Captain Abe gave the order every commanding officer dreads more than any other: abandon ship. By then, the list had grown past the point where any order could truly be called simple. The great flight deck, once flat enough to land aircraft on in any weather, now leaned like the side of a hill, steep enough that men could no longer walk across it without gripping railings, cables, anything bolted down that would hold their weight. Equipment that had been secured for a routine coastal voyage broke loose and slid across compartments, crashing into bulkheads, crushing anything caught beneath it. Loose gear became as dangerous as the flooding itself, sliding through corridors with enough force to break bones. The ship had never been fully fitted for a moment like this. Many of her lifeboats had not been properly installed before she sailed, secured instead with temporary fittings meant to hold only until the fitting out at Kure was complete. Life rafts had to be freed by hand, wrestled loose, and manhandled toward the water by men fighting a deck that no longer held level. On the port side, the severe list made launching boats nearly impossible. Davits fouled, lines tangled, boats hanging useless at impossible angles. Men began going into the water without them, some in life jackets, many without, jumping from a height that would have been unthinkable on any ordinary day, dropping into the dark Pacific because there was nothing left to do but jump. The 3 destroyers that had escorted Shinano through the night now closed in cautiously, trying to pull survivors from the water without drifting too close to the dying carrier herself. Every man aboard those destroyers understood the danger. A ship this size, when she finally went under, could pull anything nearby down into the vortex behind her, boats included. Rescue became a careful, agonizing balance between reaching men in the water and staying far enough back to survive the moment Shinano finally gave way. The water itself was cold enough to kill a man on its own given time, and the sea around the sinking carrier filled with fuel oil leaking from her ruptured tanks, coating survivors in a thick black film that burned their eyes and stung their skin as they swam. Men called out to each other in the dark, trying to hold small groups together, trying to keep the weaker swimmers afloat until a destroyer's boat could reach them. Some succeeded, many did not. By 9 in the morning, the list had reached 30 degrees. The flight deck, once the largest in the Imperial Navy, now angled so sharply that the ship resembled a hillside more than a warship. Hundreds of men remained trapped below decks, unable to reach open air through corridors that had become vertical shafts, through hatches that opened now onto walls instead of floors. The sounds described later by the men who survived those final hours were the sounds every sailor fears most: groaning steel, rushing water finding new compartments to fill, and beneath it all, the voices of men who could not get out in time. Captain Abe remained on the bridge as his ship died beneath him. There is a long tradition in naval service, in every navy, that a commanding officer stays with his ship to the end, and whatever else could be said about the choices that had brought Shinano to this moment, Abe kept that tradition without wavering. He had commanded destroyers for most of his career, fast, aggressive ships built to fight and, when necessary, to be lost quickly and cleanly. Nothing in that career had prepared him for presiding over the slow, hours-long death of the largest warship ever built under his own flag. He stayed at his post as the list grew past what any bridge crew could stand upright against, and he did not leave. At 10:18 in the morning, 7 hours after the torpedoes struck, Shinano capsized. The massive hull rolled fully onto her starboard side, the flight deck now facing straight down into the water that had been trying to claim it since 3:17 that morning. For a long, terrible moment, she seemed to hang there, floating on her side, like something too large for the ocean to fully swallow. Then the stern began to rise, slow and enormous, the great propellers breaking the surface and turning uselessly in open air. And then, with a deep sound survivors would later describe as something closer to thunder than machinery, the largest aircraft carrier ever built slid beneath the surface of the Pacific and was gone. 10:57 in the morning, November 29, 1944. Shinano was gone entirely, taking Captain Toshio Abe down with her, along with more than 1,400 of the roughly 2,200 men who had sailed from Yokosuka less than 17 hours earlier. Some drowned in flooded compartments they never escaped. Some were trapped when the ship rolled and lost the last chance to reach open water. Others died in the sea itself, exhausted, unable to hold on long enough for the destroyers to reach them in time. She had been in commission for 10 days. She had never once launched an aircraft in combat, never fired a shot at an enemy, never done anything the years of secrecy and expense had been spent to prepare her for. For Japan, the loss was more than a single ship going down. Shinano had been meant as proof that Japanese industry could still answer American power with something even larger, something capable of turning the naval war back in Japan's favor. Losing her 10 days into her first voyage, to a single submarine, before she had ever fired a shot, was a humiliation the Imperial Navy could not afford to admit. The loss was classified at the highest level available to the Japanese government. Families of the dead were told little or nothing of what had actually happened, some given only vague explanations about training accidents or operations too sensitive to describe. For years after the war ended, many people in Japan had no idea a ship called Shinano had ever existed, let alone that she had been the largest carrier in the world when she went down. For the Americans, the story unfolded very differently, and far more slowly than Enright might have hoped. When Archerfish returned to port and filed her patrol report describing a 72,000-ton carrier sunk off the Japanese coast, naval intelligence officers greeted the claim with open skepticism. There was no carrier of that size in any intelligence estimate of the Japanese fleet. No photograph, no prior sighting, nothing to confirm that such a ship even existed. It took months of work, cross-referencing intercepted Japanese communications, captured documents, and post-war interrogations, before naval intelligence could finally confirm what Enright had already known the moment he lowered his periscope that night. USS Archerfish had sunk Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in the history of naval warfare, a record that stands unbroken to this day. Joseph Enright received the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the United States Navy can award. His crew received their own commendations for a patrol that, on paper, looked almost too improbable to have happened at all. The failure of May 1943, the carrier he had once let slip through his hands, the quiet months of doubt that followed, none of it disappeared from his memory, but it no longer defined him. Archerfish continued on patrol until Japan's surrender in August 1945, survived the war entirely, and was eventually used as a target ship before being sunk for good in 1968. The submarine that had once been commanded by a man trying to outrun his own worst mistake became, instead, the boat remembered for sinking a giant. Naval analysts who studied the loss afterward largely agreed on one point. Had Shinano been complete, had her watertight doors been properly installed, had her crew been given the months of training any ship her size demanded before going to sea, she likely would have survived that night. The design was never fully tested under the conditions it was built for. What sank her was not a flaw in her armor or her compartmentalization, but the desperate math of a losing war, a decision to risk an unfinished ship at sea rather than risk losing her hull to American bombers still sitting in dry dock. Japan chose the voyage. The voyage killed her. It is worth remembering that Enright never saw any of what happened aboard Shinano in those 7 hours. He never saw the list grow past the point of return, never heard the order to abandon ship, never watched Captain Abe hold his post on a bridge tilting further by the minute. He knew only what his instruments told him in the moments after the torpedoes struck. 4 explosions, a rough count of hits, and then the discipline of taking his own boat deep and running before the destroyers overhead could find him. The rest of the story, the slow collapse of the largest carrier ever built, belonged entirely to the men who lived and died aboard her. Today, Shinano rests somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, roughly 35 miles southeast of Cape Shiono, in water deep enough that her wreck has never been located or confirmed. No expedition has recovered her. No photographs exist of what remains of the largest aircraft carrier ever built. She disappeared in 1944, the same way she had been built, in near total secrecy, and in many ways she remains there still. What happened in those 7 hours off the Japanese coast was never really about size, or armor, or the theoretical number of torpedoes a hull could absorb on paper. It was about a ship sent to sea before she was ready, a crew that never had the time to master her, and a submarine commander who had spent 18 months waiting for one more chance to prove that a missed shot did not have to be the last word on his career. 4 torpedoes, 7 hours, and the largest warship built during the Second World War was gone, carrying with her over 1,400 men, and Japan's last real hope of matching American naval power in the Pacific.